this week we actually start looking more at what other things might mean. Now, we've already kind of had a setup, a little bit of interpretation of what the living beast might be and what the elders might be. So we're building on this. It's progressive as we build and kind of collect a mental bank of interpretation for the different symbols. If things are going to start getting easier to assign either a spiritual or literal fulfillment, knowing really the ultimate goal is it was all fulfilled. So chapter 1, I'll read a couple of verses and then kind of lay out what I'm looking at. And as we mentioned before, we're going to do this week and next Sunday, and then we take 3 weeks off. And at the end of next week, if you want to get the notes, they're like $1 a chapter, so it'll be like $5. Some of you purchased the notes before, so you can get these next 4 chapters as well. If you're tuning in and you haven't had a chance to purchase any of them, you can buy all of them. And that includes our introductory week that we laid out the history behind it. So just making that available to you. You can reach me at tjsmithmusic@yahoo.com if you have any questions off air. And if we can get done soon enough, remember, start logging in and asking questions. And if I think to look down or somebody lets me know, we can stop where we are and address the question until waiting till the very end. I don't mind at all. So let's go to chapter 6. And it says, I saw the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard I heard one of the living 4 creatures saying in a voice as of thunder, "Come and see." And I saw and beheld a white horse, and he who sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given to him. He went forth conquering and to conquer. You're probably putting this together yourself, but my take on it is the white horse is symbolic of victory. The proof in this, in their culture, is that the Roman army used white horses for their elite generals and also in their celebrations and parades after a victory. All the big guys got to sit on white horses. Now, we understand that the one on the horse was Yeshua, and the bow represents war, but from a distance first. So this could be in reference to Psalm 7:13. He has also prepared for him the instruments of death. He ordained his arrows against his persecutors. So Jesus had already been conquering sin and death, but now was about to complete his tour of duty with these judgments. And the other one little piece here that's, I think, informational is that the being the bow, indicating from a distance. When Rome landed, they landed up north by Ephesus and started working their way towards Jerusalem, burning and killing all the way down through all those cities. So that would be your symbol of it being from a distance. It hadn't got there yet, but war had already begun. Verse 3, and he opened the second seal, and I heard the second beast say, "Come and see." So this act of opening is to be understood as Jesus being now the full authority, as acting as Yahweh. And he's been given the power to enact judgment. That's been given over to the Son. This also completes Jesus's journey to be called Yahweh, which was already his designation by the apostles. You remember several times the apostle would say, "You are Lord," and it's in capital. And anytime we see Lord in capital letters, that's really the substitution for Yahweh, because the Jews didn't want to say the name Yahweh, so they came up with this Lord to substitute, because they were so afraid of taking the Lord's name in vain that they decided they would just never say it. So that's where we get that from. In verse 4, And there went out another horse, and it was red. And to him who sat on it was given power to take away peace from the earth, that people should kill one another, and there was given him a great sword. Now, these two words, one another, that's the Greek word alelone. This is used 110 times in 94 verses in the New Testament. In every instance, alelone refers to a group of people that know each other and have something in common. Never enemies, never strangers. Okay, here's a couple of examples. Galatians 6:2, bear ye one another's elelone burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Matthew 15:31, likewise also the chief priests mocking said amongst themselves, elelone. In Luke 6:11, they were filled with madness and communed with one another, elelone, what they might do to Jesus. So there's 107 more of those I could go through, but we'd be here all night. So regardless of the group being discussed or their reason for unity, this word, elelone, is always used of a group of people that know each other and have some kind of a common goal or community with each other. So it would be out of character for this one verse in Revelation to be speaking of enemies going to battle against one another. Now, we remember the words of Jesus in Matthew 10:34. You may not suppose that I came to put peace on the earth. I did not come to put peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man at variance against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And the enemies of a man are those of his own household. So it's apparent to me that this verse speaks of the symbolic red horse as the Spirit of God sent to turn the Jewish brother against his Jewish brother, which is what happened in 67 AD when inside the walls of Jericho, there were two political factions at war trying to control the city. They were one was led by John of the Giscala, and the other was Simon the Zealot. These two men wanted to run the city, and they were responsible for torching the grain supply of their in the city, which would have fed the Jews for 2 years. That's really what brought the famine inside the city. But they set the grain on fire, blamed it on the Romans, hoping that this would rally all the Jewish people to go to battle. So it backfired on them. Now, they set the city on fire themselves. They murdered priests in the temple, hundreds of thousands of their own Jews. In fact, one of the Josephus records that one of the Roman guards said at one of the gates, counted over 116,000 Jews were thrown over the walls. They murdered the priests in the temple. They were responsible for the ending of the daily sacrifice. To make the red horse into some catastrophic worldwide catastrophe is to pervert the established use of the word elelone. This is yet another indicator to interpret that the judgment was only against Jerusalem, the people of Israel. And by staying with the common, usual, contextual definition of this word, we're also paying respect to the principles of context and word usage, because that's the two most important things when interpreting. Okay, big mouthful. Verse 5. And when he opened the third seal, I heard a beast say, come and see. And behold, I saw a black horse, and he who sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. Now, this imagery could have had multiple meanings. And as I've said in past weeks, don't believe me. Study for yourself, okay? Be a Berean. Research it. Read about it. Study their customs. Now, this imagery of scales could have been that Jerusalem was weighed by God and found lacking in obedience, compassion, love, honor, respect, and faithfulness. This could be the reference we read in Daniel 5:27. Thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. Okay. Verse 6. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, a measure of wheat for a denarius, and 3 measures of barley for a denarius, and see that you not damage the oil and the wine. Now, the scales from the previous verse can also be representative of the famine and the greedy prices charged for food during the famines that broke out not only in Jerusalem, but the whole entire Roman Empire went through famines during this time. A denarius was a typical day's wages. During the famines, Tacitus, the historian Tacitus, recorded that grain and wheat had risen to 20 times their usual prices. So if a loaf of bread was $2, now it's $40. Jerusalem wasn't the only area stricken with famine. Claudius faced a famine in Rome when he was an emperor. There was an overflow in the Tiber River during the reign of Otho that caused a famine. Vespasian deliberately caused famine by stopping the supplies of provisions. And the Savior predicted these wars and famines in Matthew 27:7. For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in diverse places. Now, if we're not studying Jewish history, we're going to get swept away by every little wind of doctrine that we find on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC that, oh, look at all the wars in the world. And this was predicted. I mean, my daughter sent me a Facebook page entry from people that are talking about this very thing right now. Oh, this is the end of the world. So unless we study to show ourselves approved, we're going to be led astray. That all of these things we'll be able to prove Jesus talked about, and then we'll see their fulfillment, okay? Now, the part of the verse that says, do no wrong to the oil and wine, I've read about a half a dozen commentators on this with some research, could have the understanding that these two items were considered luxuries that no one could afford to buy during the time. And Josephus wrote that the rich were selling all they had just to buy grain. Then they were eating it raw because they had no way to take the time to grind out the grain and mix it into a pat and bake it. They were just, this was horrible. So the meaning in the Greek might really be the oil and wine won't be abused, or it won't even be accessed or utilized. So another point made here is by F.W. Farrar. He's got a great book called The Early Days of Christianity. I suggest you get on Amazon and purchase that. He's from the mid to early 1800s, and he's just fabulous with facts that he's put together. He wrote that John of Giscala, one of those political factions, had seized the temple, and he and his bandits were indulging in all of the sacred wine and the oil used for sacrifice and duties. They consumed so much that they were constantly drunk and sometimes unable to fight against Simon the Zealot, who was outside of the temple area. Also in Rome, wine was so plentiful that Nero plowed the vineyards under to start raising corn instead. So we will see later. Now, I'm giving away something early here. The Roman coin, referred to as the mark, was used to purchase food. Every Caesar that came into power would strike his own image on a new set of money that would say, I'm now in power. And that is how historians go back and look when they're digging, archaeologists are digging, and they find coins, they can pretty well know what era that was from. So it made all the previous coins worthless. Now, Nero was known as the beast, and this was his financial instrument being used from the time of 53 to 67 AD. So, guess what? You could not buy or sell without the mark of the beast on your coins. Gee, was that too much of a riddle? Did everybody get that out there? Okay, I didn't mean to give the surprise away too soon, but I think it was important. Verse 7, and when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the fourth beast say, "Come and see." And I looked and beheld a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on him was Death, and hell followed after him. And power was given him over a fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword and famine and death, and with the wild beast of the earth. Now, this fourth part of the earth is a riddle that anyone who's ever studied Revelation has wondered about. I've heard interpretations that God is in the first part of the earth, but it's not really earth. And then there was a second heaven, and that was the second part of the earth. And then the third, and so it's gone vertical and it's gone horizontally. When we try to identify these symbols and categorize them in our minds, for interpretation, sometimes you just have to go ahead, grab one of those definitions, and start applying it. If it's not a good option, let it go and go back and grab another one of those options. Pretty soon, you're probably going to find the right one, and it's going to be consistent to apply it throughout all of Revelation or Daniel or Zechariah. But don't be afraid to grab an opinion and hold on to it until you study and you realize, you know what, that really doesn't work out. So I'm going to go back to square one and grab a different one. So in this case, I put myself in the place of an ancient Israel and try to think like a Jew. The ancient world map of Jerusalem that they considered that they lived in looks like this. You've got Africa. You've got, there we go. That looks a little better, doesn't it? Sorry, folks. You got Africa, you got Asia, and Europe. Look what's right in the middle. Look at the fourth part of the earth. It's Jerusalem. Okay? 1, 2, 3, and Jerusalem is in the middle. They're the fourth part. And really, Jerusalem wasn't the only ones who felt like they were the center of the universe, the center of the world. Kings and pharaohs, leaders from other countries would come to Jerusalem just to stare and have a tour of the temple. It was so magnificent. They would bring offerings, hoping that the high priest would offer them up to our God, Yahweh. So it was pretty important place. Now, but you notice you really didn't see Africa. You didn't see Australia. Come on, they probably never went. So it didn't matter to them. That was not part of their world. They had interaction with Asia, Europe, and Africa. So we've already established this judgment was about Jerusalem, so it's not going to circle the entire globe. So with this hypothesis, let's continue to see if the prophecies about the fourth part of the earth points to Israel. If they don't, then we need to go back and we need to kind of think about another possibility. It's pretty simple to do that. So Josephus, Suetonius, Eusebius, and other historians recorded numerous famines and pestilence during this time, as well as Christians being fed to lions by the thousands. In fact, one of the historians wrote that the lions were actually fed on a daily basis by humans. I mean, humans weren't giving them the food, they were the food. So here is something from Deuteronomy 28:54. And toward her young that cometh out from between her feet, giving birth, and toward her children which she shall bear, for she shall eat them for want of all things, in the siege wherein thine enemy shall distress you in all your gates. So Josephus is giving account of a woman found by the Roman guards who actually boiled and ate her infant son and then offered the rest of the baby to the Roman guards. And it said they ran away in shock. If thou wilt not observe to do all the works of this law that are written in this book, that thou mayest fear this glorious and fearful name, the Lord thy God, then the Lord will make thy plagues wonderful, and the plagues of thy seed, even great plagues, and of long continuance, and much sicknesses, and long continuance. He says it twice. These very things that John is predicting to soon happen, the time is at hand, shortly, was actually on top of them. It was there. Okay? Moreover, he will bring upon thee all these sicknesses of Egypt, which thou were afraid of, and they shall cleave unto thee. Also every sickness and plague which is not written in the book of this law, them will Yahweh bring upon thee until you are destroyed. Because of the death and the putrefying of carcasses in the city, disease and pestilence became a plague of all of its own, and it killed tens of thousands that were trapped inside. Now, I mentioned one of the books earlier you should add to your library. The other book is by Josephus. It's called The War of the Jews, where he goes into very strict detail about everything that happened back then. That's another book you need to read, and you'll get a firm grasp of how horrifying this destruction really was. Now, here's another part of that verse that we read earlier. And the Lord will scatter thee among the people from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods, which neither you nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. So these little idols they made. So what happened? After the war, almost 100,000 Jews were taken as slaves and were shipped off to other countries where they had to live, and they never got to return. So you had about a 10% survival rate. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall your sole of the foot have rest, but the Lord shall give thee a trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. Now, that was the end of the passage from Deuteronomy. Because of this judgment, I think we can all agree that the Jews are the most hated race on the planet. It seems that in every century, these poor people have faced abolishment, wars, expulsion, murder from countries that don't even believe in God. It's just like something's happened and everybody hates them but America. So you can see this judgment, how it affected them. And we can see how in Deuteronomy that's been fulfilled, and how in John this is why it's going to be fulfilled. So now we're at Revelation 6:9, verse 9. And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that had been slain for the sake of the word of God and for the testimony of the Lamb which they had. Little clues to think about. These are souls, not bodies, that John perceives. That's the Greek word. He perceived of the souls of former prophets who died because of their holding to the message of the Savior and the testimony of the Lamb. Legally, testimonies can only be submitted by an eyewitness. So this would make you think that these souls under the altar would probably only be the people from John the Baptist forward. However, I believe it'd be much more inclusive thought that even the prophets of the Old Testament were given insight into the Christ. Though Hebrews, the book of Hebrews states that those prophets really didn't understand to what the prophecies were given or to who they were going to be given to. They just knew it wasn't going to be them. And that's how the author of Hebrews puts it, that they knew it was something that was going to happen, but they just knew it wasn't going to be them. So we compare how the prophets of the first century were killed, and I count John the Baptist and Paul and Peter, the 12, Stephen, any other Christian calling for repentance and salvation that was involved in the spreading of the gospel. Consider them a prophet. And they were actually still under the old covenant, but passing out of it into the new covenant. That was what they call the transition period. Since it was passing away and being replaced with the new. And you remember when Paul talks about the two mountains who are two mothers, Sarah and Hagar. And the authors, Paul says, as long as Hagar and Ishmael were in the house, Jacob couldn't inherit the promises. So Abraham sent his oldest son away so that the younger son could be the true inheritor. This is what was happening. God was kicking Ishmael out of the house with his mother, the old covenant. But you notice there was a time when both covenants were in existence. That's what they call that overlay, while one is passing away and the other is coming. So, Revelation 6:10. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Yahweh? It says Lord in capital letters. That's Yahweh. Holy and true, do you not judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And a white robe was given to each one of them, and it was said to them that you should rest for a little while until the time should be fulfilled when your fellow servants and their brethren should be killed also as they had been. Remember back to the 7 churches in chapter 2 and 3? Most of them were given a robe of white. So we can kind of discern that, yeah, they're probably some of the very ones that this verse speaks of. This was a direct allusion, this verse here we just read, to Daniel 12, 7 through 10. I'll read it for you. And one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders or signs? And I heard a man clothed in linen, which was up on the waters of the river, where he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him that liveth forever, that it shall be for a time, times and a half. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things will be finished. I heard and didn't understand. And oh my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many will be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. So we back up a little bit. This time, times, plural, and half a time, prophetic language, that's 1 year, times is 2 years, and then half a time, 3.5 years. Wow, what a coincidence. That's exactly how long this war lasted. The breaking the power of the holy people through destruction, murder, and sold into slavery, that's how the power of the Jewish people was broken. Now, Daniel gives us the origin of this type of apocalyptic language. He's the one that really sets it up. John refers back to it because, of course, the Jewish people understood that. He speaks of this in Revelation. Daniel speaks of it. So since we know, because he was told to seal up the book. Now, when was the book supposed to be unsealed? When the things happened. How is it we have the book of Daniel in the Bible if it hadn't happened yet? It should still be sealed up somewhere. Remember, that's what the Bible said about itself. So the time of the end is not the end of time, the time of the end of the old covenant. That's what we're talking about. So, verse 12. And I beheld when he opened the sixth seal, behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth and hair. And the moon became as blood, and the stars in the heaven fell to the earth, even as a fig tree cast her green figs when she is shaken by a mighty wind. Okay, a couple of interpretations here, being literal and figurative, are this. You remember that Joseph told his father about his dream? He said, "Hey, Dad, I had a dream last night. I dreamed that the sun and the moon and the stars were all going to bow down to me." What does Dad say? "What? You really think me and your mother and your brothers are going to bow down and worship you?" Now, why would his dad say that? That's crazy. Unless that's the way they spoke and they understood that figurative speech. Why didn't Joseph correct his father and say, "Whoa, Dad, whoa, what do you mean? Come on, Pop. I wasn't saying that. I meant that, the earth, I meant the sun and the moon are going to get on the edge of the horizon and they're going to go, 'I bow down to you.' And they're going to go up and down out in space like that, Dad. Come on. I mean, Dad, why would I say that you were going to bow down to me? That's crazy, old man." No. Daniel didn't correct his father's thinking. So that was the cultural way they understood the signs and the symbolism of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now, called Hebraic imagery, it's foreign to us 2,000 years later. So therefore, what do? Oh, we impose this wooden, literal meaning on these phrases, and suddenly stars have to fall. But wait, stars aren't held up by gravity. They don't fall. And the sun's going to go black. Okay, once the sun goes black, we freeze to death in about 5 hours. And even if it did come back, it's too late because we're already dead. All plant life died. I mean, it's crazier to believe what it says than to make it sound literal. You believe the symbolism and compare it to the way the Hebrews thought, suddenly it makes sense. Now, we see this subject, this imagery of the stars and the moons and the sun either being blotted out or passing away or turning to blood. You do a search in the Old Testament, see how many times those are used. It's always about an upcoming judgment. Then what happens in the Old Testament? The judgment comes, but the sun's still in the sky, and so is the moon, and the stars are still there. It was apocalyptic language, not intended to be taken literal, okay? Now, here, God used the language to describe the judgments he was bringing. Yet the sun didn't go out, moon didn't become as blood. The other imagery tying into this, which will come up on later chapters, is that Rome represented the sun. That was the authority. Jerusalem was the feminine counterpart, just like Joseph's mother was the feminine. She was the moon. In fact, we understand Israel has even been labeled as a bride. God called her a whore at times, and God married another bride. We had a wedding. So there's all of this great wedding imagery, feminine, masculine. We have to remember that when we're interpreting. The stars would have been the Sanhedrin and all of the leaders associated with the temple. God used Rome to punish and end Judaism and as we've seen, the moon literally did turn to blood in Jerusalem for 3.5 years. Josephus records this, quote, multitudes of the dead and dying were heaped around the altar to which they formerly fled for protection, while the steps that led to it from the outer court was literally deluged with blood. He continues, even such as those who brought sacrifices to the temple were murdered by John of Giscala. The dead bodies of priests and worshipers, both native and foreigners, were heaped together, and a lake of blood stagnated in the sacred courts. The bodies of the dead choked up alleys and narrow passages, and their blood flowed down the channels of the city in streams. The vial of divine wrath, which had been so long pouring out upon this devoted city, was now emptying, and Jerusalem, once the praise of all the earth, was now deprived of life, wrapped up in flames and bleeding on every side from utter ruin and destruction. Verse 16, and the heavens separated as a scroll when it is rolled separately, and every mountain and island shifted from its resting place. And the kings of the earth and the great men and the captains of thousands and the rich and the mighty men and bondsmen, every free man, hid themselves in caves and in clefts of the mountain, and said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us, hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? Okay, more imagery. However, we do get literal examples to fulfill these images. Now, it wouldn't be reasonable to think that that would happen today as people wanting to escape, they just book a flight and jump into their car. So how many caves do we have access to now? I mean, however, in that culture, since we're going to think like a Hebrew, caves were numerous, and they were used as living quarters, storage units, refuge from thieves and the weather. Here's another Josephus account. Quote, they sought refuge in caverns and subterraneous passages in which dismal retreats, no less than 2,000 dead bodies were found afterwards. Also, he says, not less than 1,100,000 were killed in the city, not to mention 237,000 in other cities, and innumerable multitudes swept away by famine and pestilence, on which there is no calculation that could be made. So, I highly recommend that you purchase Josephus's The War of the Jews. It's a fascinating book. It gives the daily accounts of what was happening. You even start to kind of feel sorry for Titus, who was the general that had to finally break into the walls and put an end to it. There are quotes where he had Josephus right beside him to communicate with the Jews and would tell them, please don't make me do this. The hand of God and the wrath of God has come against you. I don't want to be his hand. Give up. Stop what you do. I mean, it's almost like Titus got it more than the Jews did, that this was a divine wrath brought upon Jerusalem. So that is the end of our verse, the end of our chapter. We're going to be here next week. And then we'll take a break for 3 weeks after that. Maria and I are going to go see our grandbaby in South Dakota. So we're excited about that. And let's see if anyone has any questions, anything you'd like to say. And I will go ahead and turn it back over to Kent until we see if we've got anything else, brother.
Okay. Thank you, TJ. Hey, that was really good.